Hidden deep within a dense, remote jungle, the silent remains of a long-lost civilization rest beneath the canopy. What was once pristine and bustling with a people who mysteriously vanished has slowly crumbled into obscurity, being overtaken by the march of time and the relentless grasp of nature. The legend surrounding it is one that tells of calamity, opportune takeovers, and new life thriving in the shadow of things past. The tale goes like this. Nothing is known about who built this or when, though with no one to care for it, nature's takeover was inevitable. The catalyst of it all was the frequent rains and constant humidity of the forest. Before long weathering occurred, setting the stage for life to emerge. Nearby, the sporophyte or fruiting body of moss released tiny spores into the air. The moist conditions and primed surfaces were ideal for them to settle and sprout. Details soon faded as lush carpets of green rapidly formed. Moss is among the first plants to grow in bare disturbed areas. As it takes hold, it retains water and helps create soil, often laying the foundation for an ecosystem to begin. That's what happened here. Seed pods, leaves, and other materials tossed by the wind not only collected around the structures, but also around the moss. These piles provided refuge for tiny springtails who thrived in the damp conditions. Here they played a major role in breaking down decaying organic matter, and as they did, nutrient-rich soil accumulated. This enticed others to pass through, though they preferred a nomadic lifestyle. Slowly but surely, this inhospitable landscape became a nursery, a place where those wind-tossed seeds could now settle and take root. While the takeover had been gradual thus far, the formation of soil bridged the gap, allowing the plants to establish quickly. However, they weren't alone. With their aerial roots, the trees above had the same objective. They reached toward the ground, pierced the soil, and spidered through the landscape, leaving destruction in their path. Even as wildlife and plants encroached on the abandoned structures, it remained fairly recognizable. That would soon change, but not without warning. A cacophony of anxious jungle animals sounded out, serving as an omen for the impending calamity. A tangible, eerie silence followed. In the aftermath of a violent earthquake, the landscape was almost unrecognizable. Undermined by the fierce tremors, structures that once retained soil and stones were now covered by them. However, the story didn't end with toppled columns, a damaged face, and crushed plants. Nature's progress was only challenged for a moment. Immediately, the relentless forest claimed the displaced soil where the previous plants perished. This succession blurred the line between the ruins and the surrounding landscape. With it came new life, a tiny snail who blissfully enjoyed his kingdom. All the while, another line was blurring, that between the ground and the canopy as more aerial roots made their way to the soil, but this time they weren't alone. In tandem, vines began to sag as the trees struggled to support their weight. Seeds from a mother air plant took advantage of these mossy cradles. Here the wet season encouraged their growth while also eroding the disturbed soil. Shifting lands revealed an otherworldly light. It emanated from the ground, as if calling back to the life of a city that once was. These glowing crystals had formed alongside the volcanic stones long before any of this was here, waiting to be unearthed from a time capsule of dirt. The rain significantly accelerated the jungle's grasp as well. Plants took full advantage of every inch, including the now flooded foundation. Where there's water, there tends to be life, yet this wasn't enough to entice full-time residents. The land insisted on changing that. Gradual shifts in the terrain uphill were redirecting water toward this location for some time. Eventually, a small stream made its way to the very edge of the now weakened ruins. This part of the jungle had now assimilated into a larger wetland, and with the rise of water came the promise of new life. However, it wasn't visible until everything settled. A vast network of plants sprang up, and within them were various creatures that had been swept from upstream. Little snails took up residence, happily grazing on the surfaces. Tiny scuds were also hard at work, meticulously breaking down the leaf litter. As organics decomposed, tannins stained the water like tea, and with it came a bloom of daphnia. Enticed by the suspended nutrients, these microcrustaceans swarmed the submerged ruins. However, their presence attracted a school of hungry tetras. As rapidly as the Daphnia appeared, their populations were decimated. The fish may have been lured in by food, but they decided to stay, finding safety in the shadow of the ruins. All the while, a different story had been unfolding in the ever-changing lands above. A new proximity to water stimulated the moss, allowing it to advance further than before. These conditions also matured the aerial roots, and with the forest's overflow came many new and unusual plants. Naturally, this encouraged more creatures to find their home here, enjoying the peace it provided. They casually explored the ruins, unaware of what stirred in the shadows. A vampire crab was on the prowl for this cricket, but it sensed the danger, fleeing before it was too late. Unfazed, the crab decided to sift through moss instead. It had been attracted by the scent of water, and it wasn't alone. One by one, a multitude of crabs descended upon the lands, claiming the ruins for themselves. These versatile creatures mastered the environment they now found themselves in, wading in the falls, climbing to the heights of the canopy, and descending into the waters below. Without any resistance, the crabs asserted their dominance. Abundant food and ideal conditions led to their proliferation. Like them, their offspring carefully searched through the moss for any available morsels. As it goes, the remains stood helpless against nature's relentless advances. The jungle didn't just claim the land, it reshaped it, molding it into a sanctuary where life thrived in the shadow of things past.
This is where I break the fourth wall to tell you that most of that happened within this glass box. Of course, I made it to tell a story, but that wasn't all. I also wanted to make a newer version of the Ancient Ruins Paludarium I made in 2022 and rehome my vampire crabs. Here's the truth behind the legend.
I planned a revision before I even had vampire crabs, yet it didn't commence until I started streamlining the animal room last year by consolidating old or hard to maintain setups. I wasn't content with the crab's tank for reasons I'll explain, and combining the concepts into a single setup made sense. I had the bottom from an old 75-gallon tank and an open spot for it, so that's the footprint I chose. I assembled it like an aquarium except for the front, which is shorter to make room for sliding glass doors. I made the decorations in the old version by carving clay, taking molds, and casting resin. That worked well, so I wanted to do something similar here, but instead with vertical concrete. I knew it would be perfect for the ruins effect based on how well it worked for Samson and Pistachio. Both are still enjoying their setups to this day. Funny enough, this is the same clay I used 3 years ago. This time I made a detailed face that differed from the impressionist style of the first. That was until I got to the eyes. For whatever reason, I initially tried to mimic the original, but it just looked bad. After fixing that, it ended up looking like Olmec, which wasn't my plan. Now I know that many of you are 90s kids as well, so I'm curious how many of you already said that in the comments. While you're there, if you haven't already, I'd appreciate it if you helped support the video if you enjoyed it so far. With the columns, I first created an armature from scrap boards to build on. Though it worked, if I were to do this over, I would use something else. It was hard to remain consistent. I knew most of this would be hidden in the end, which highlights attention, providing enough detail for the narrative without being excessive. I felt like these line patterns were a good balance. Additionally, this had to be taller than the enclosure to create land after the earthquake. I made the casting form simply by screwing boards around the clay and sealing the cracks with hot glue. However, I later filled the gap on this one with foam to maximize the silicone pour, which was a 1-to-1 self-degassing mix. That meant all I had to do was blend the parts together and fill the form. Once cured, I pulled the molds, removed the clay, and scrubbed out any remnants. That meant it was finally time for the vertical concrete. It takes detail well, is lightweight for concrete, and appears to have minimal impact on water parameters, though your mileage may vary. For those reasons and what I said before, I had to use it here. Since the face is small, I was able to fill it completely, but that would have been excessive with the columns, so I lined them instead. However, it kept slipping down the silicone and needed temporary support until it cured. Unfortunately, the footage of the face being demolded completely disappeared. Aside from pitting, it looked good. Thankfully, the column process was exactly the same, and I had that strangely satisfying footage. However, I did do it 3 more times, and by the end of it, I was about ready to move on to something else. Between casts, I made sure to fill the pits with leftovers. Afterward, I had to sand out inconsistencies. I had to build a plywood form to do this right. It wasn't for casting anything though. It matched the tank's footprint and would serve as a set for the events before the earthquake. While I did break some of the fourth wall, I won't reveal everything. What I will share is that I temporarily attached the items I already made either with glue or boards. Then I used scraps of EVA foam to make tiles for the spaces. I glued them into a form and repeated the earlier steps. Once made, I secured them and filled the gaps with silicone or sand. I also wanted a motif to ground the location within a changing environment, so I made this thing. The first change was weathering, which I achieved with water-based glazes. Hues like black, umber, and maple did most of the work, but yellow accents help create the mossy look you'd expect to see in the jungle. I always have to remind myself to trust the process when I use this because of how it looks before it dries. Once it did, I created highlights with steel wool and sandpaper. Otherwise, I temporarily attached items and used practical effects like stop motion to create visuals. I knew there'd be no going back once I broke the scape during the earthquake, so I took my time with that before it inevitably happened. However, I still hadn't addressed filtration, so I drilled the tank for bulkheads, added those and barbed elbows before dismantling the set. Rebuilding it was less straightforward. Aside from shortening the tiles, the middle section was largely untouched. So after modifying those, I secured the pieces with silicone. Getting the columns to look like they collapsed is what brought the challenge. I transferred angles with foam before cutting them with a saw, which is wildly inefficient. I have better tools for the job, but I didn't want to create a cloud of dust in the process. I also chipped off edges with a chisel and broke the pieces apart to create wear. Silicone held everything with ease, but I had to be mindful of the cracks. All of these areas would later hold substrate, so sealing them from the inside was a must. I drilled a hole in this tile to account for the bulkhead too. Piece by piece it came together in a way that best served the animals and aligned with the narrative. That was only the beginning, because now I had to create the illusion of a landslide. For the ease of explanation, I'll present this by task, not in the order they occurred. For this area, I cut a carbon filter mat to fit the gap. Waterfall foam was perfect for sealing and securing it simultaneously. Then I built a retaining wall from lava rocks and a tree fern panel. That would have looked weird on its own, so I detailed it by adding roots and stones, blending everything together with super glue and cocoa fiber. I did something similar here by partitioning the back with tree fern and creating a filter mat platform. I even supercharged some areas with capillary wicking rope to help draw water to the moss. The soil had to appear as if it had an origin. I did that by using the same materials and techniques, creating a seamless transition between the top and the concrete ruins. Speaking of those, I also chiseled the face. I imagined the rock that would become the base of the waterfall tumbled out and damaged it. Having to plan everything so far in advance was probably the most challenging aspect of this project. For example, the lights were much harder to install than they should have been, even though the process looks simple. I secured them with silicone, then created slopes with stones and foam to hide them until the reveal. Another was the waterfall entry point. Hiding the plumbing while ensuring I still had full access wasn't easy. Fortunately, by the time the moss was ready to go back in, it was smooth sailing. After moving the tank, I could create the land. A portion of what's visible would be submerged, so I filled the voids just above the waterline with lava rocks. Then I made a barrier from filter mats, topped with sphagnum moss to fill gaps. The substrate is similar to what I usually use. A blend of components that, when mixed, retain moisture and resist compaction, thereby promoting soil health and crab excavation. This highlights a misstep with their first tank that I wanted to rectify with this one. While it had many land areas, they weren't very substantial. This tank has more surface area, with depths ranging from 5 to 12 inches. That's a significant improvement that the crabs will appreciate. A way I was able to add some extra volume to this was by creating retaining features throughout. Anticipating the flood, I did things differently in the water feature. I added nutrient-rich substrate bags, then a layer of sand. I also mixed in tiles, though I'd later remove them to make room for plants. Of course, I hid the lights in the process, and even sprinkled sand throughout to create a smoother transition between the land and the water. A layer of leaf litter helped with that as well. As the story progressed, I filled the tank with plants that would thrive in these conditions while fitting the theme. I also added more spiderwood, secured the jungle vines directly to the frame with wire, and glued the air plants. Making the crystals was easy because I've had time to develop this technique. I first tried it in this tank using glass, then again in this one with actual quartz, which is what I did here. I used a hole saw and glass to extract pieces to build on. Then I secured clusters of quartz with hot glue to get a basic shape. However, silicone is actually what holds them together. Silicone also would have been the easiest way to stick them to the lights, but I couldn't risk having fumes in the tank this late in the process. That's where aquarium-safe epoxy saved the day. I hid it with rocks and sand. The flood was on the horizon, so I had to switch focus to the waterfall. To begin, I stacked stones at the bottom. However, I couldn't allow water to flood the column. Instead of going all the way up with rocks as is, I cut a hole in a scrap of pond liner to separate the falls from the land. Effectively hiding this was easier said than done, but it did the trick quite well, especially with moss tying it all together. Finally, I added the aquatic plants, filled it up, and tested the flow. The canister filter was stronger than I expected, so I dialed it back with a ball valve on the return. It also has a built-in heater and is filled with cycled biological media. Using Mom from their old tank and Roy Boss tea allowed me to get the seasoned black water look from Go. That meant that snails and scuds were free to enter their new home, quickly settling in. Then came the Daphnia, a welcome treat for the Ember Tetras, who cleared them out before going about business as usual. They seemed to enjoy this upgrade.
Now I'm finally able to add the crabs.
I divided the crabs by size when I pulled them from the old tank so that I could add them at different times. This allowed me to get an accurate census for the first time since I put them in it. In a video I uploaded a year ago, I said something to this effect. While I've enjoyed having them in here, I've decided not to keep it going for reasons I'll explain later. Just know that I'm already working on a larger and better home for them, and when the transfer occurs, we can get an exact count. That'll probably be in 3 to 4 months, so their numbers will increase before then. My guess is 93. What's yours? I'll shout out your comment in that video if you get close. These 3 comments are the closest to how many I found, 45. I counted 48 last year, so I was perplexed expecting more. I can only speculate, but here's what I came up with. First, I think it's likely that I double counted when I did it before, inflating the original number. Whether or not that's the case, there are other factors I didn't initially consider, like the age of the crabs the colony began with. Most of the ones I found and transferred into this tank are juveniles or smaller, leading me to believe the older ones have aged out. However, I suspect the tank may have just reached its carrying capacity due to the lack of substrate, putting more pressure on territorial demands. The larger enclosure and improvements I made will help, though moving forward, I plan to regularly transfer crabs to prevent overpopulation. My goals with this setup were simple: recreate the ancient ruins Paludarium, tell a story in the process, and rehome the animals. Doing so took a lot of work, so I'm ecstatic to finally share it with all of you, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you did, you'll also like the time I grew a lily pad aquarium, or when I made a rainforest for a milk snake. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, Serpa Squad, take care and peace.